Hey, Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on a sermon from our series, Make It Personal. A series filled with special interviews and guest speakers that are challenging us to embrace the outcast, the outsider, and the overlooked. Also in this series, we've been zeroing in on the well-known story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wealthy tax collector who lived in Jericho and who had a reputation for cheating people out of their money. The gospel writer Luke records how one day this notorious businessman heard that a famous rabbi named Jesus was passing through his village. In an attempt to get a glimpse of him, Zacchaeus sprinted ahead of the crowd and he climbed up a sycamore tree. Now, sycamore trees have big trunks, slick bark, and there's a big distance from the ground to their first branch, and so it wouldn't have been an easy task for Zach to climb up the tree. However, it turns out it was well worth his effort, because as Jesus passed through town, he stopped, looked up, and called Zach by name. And if that wasn't shocking enough, Jesus then invites himself over to Zach's home for supper. The locals were in disbelief. I mean, why would he show favor to a tax collector? Like, does Jesus not care about all the families this man has cheated? Like, what good could come from spending time with the most dishonest person in all of Jericho? When the crowd looked at Zach, they saw someone who was driven by personal greed. They saw someone who used and abused others to get ahead, and they saw someone who only cared about himself. But Jesus saw something they didn't. He saw a man with intrinsic worth. He saw a man who reflected God's image, and he saw someone with extraordinary potential. As Pastor Nathan shared, Zach was searching. Up until that point in his life was empty. It was lonely. It was a shallow existence, and they had left him wanting. Zacchaeus had lost his identity, his view of himself. He felt insecure and insignificant. His life didn't have the value or worth. He felt like he was nothing more than the negative labels people had put on him. Zacchaeus had also lost his sense of belonging, his connection with others. He was lonely. He didn't have intimate, life-giving connections with other people. His relationships were all shallow, and what's more, Zacchaeus had lost his purpose, his contribution to the world. There was nothing in his life that gave his life purpose or meaning. Now, here's a secret that's not so secret. Every person on this planet wants the same things. They want to be seen, they want to be known, and they want to be loved. Prior to meeting Jesus, Zach had lost his sense of identity, belonging, and purpose. It probably wasn't intentional. It just kind of happened through a series of poor decisions. His obsession with money, power, and position over time had caused him to lose his way. It caused him to forfeit a meaningful relationship with his family, friends, and community. And worst of all, he was now trapped in a corrupt government system with no way out. So without a doubt, Zach felt a sense of shame over all of this, and he knew he was a sinner. He knew he was guilty of many offenses, and the problem with shame, however, is that it shuts a person's self-worth down and it alienates them from other people and the one thing that can help them the most, and love. Even worse, shame is cyclical. In other words, people who feel intense shame are often likely to impose shame on those who have less power than themselves. Now, here's the good news. Jesus came to break this cycle. It's what makes his encounter with Zach so powerful. Jesus, unlike the religious leaders, did not impose more shame on Zach. Rather, Jesus entered Zacchaeus' house to demonstrate his love for Zacchaeus and to rescue him from a cycle of shame that Zacchaeus could not break on his own. For the first time, Zach started to see what could be true of his life. He started to realize his potential to be part of God's remarkable story, and he dared to believe that he could be transformed from a greedy tax collector into a generous friend. That's why in that moment, Zach stood up and shouted without hesitation, "Here and now I will give away half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And then this is what Jesus says in response. He says, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Now, when we read terms like salvation and lost, our minds quickly shift to ideas of eternity. And as such, some might assume that this is a great story about a man who decided to believe in Jesus so that he could avoid going to hell when he died. But there's so much more going on. When Jesus said, "Today salvation has come to your house," Jesus was not simply saying you are going to go to hell when you die. You're not going to go to hell when you die, but now you're going to go to heaven. It was more like Jesus was saying you were living in hell, and now you can start discovering what heaven is like. And that's the power of the gospel. It should never be limited to what happens to someone after they die. The gospel should always be thought of in the context of how it impacts their life right now and for eternity. Jesus gave Zach something money could not buy. Jesus gave Zacchaeus a sense of identity. I'm a child of God. Zach now knew who he was. He was loved and accepted by his creator. He was a child of God. Jesus gave Zacchaeus belonging. I belong in God's family. He now knew he was no longer alone. He was now connected to God's forever family. And Jesus gave Zacchaeus purpose. that he said, I'm invited into God's story. His life now has purpose. He was invited to participate and contribute to God's unfolding story. And here's the amazing thing. Jesus always made it personal with people. Jesus was on the road to Jerusalem to save the world, but on his way to the cross, he stopped to save one person and remind the rest of us that the mission is always personal. Think about what Jesus did for Zacchaeus. Jesus identified Zach in a way that communicated value. Jesus instinctively addressed what mattered most to Zach. Jesus took the time to enter into Zach's everyday world. Jesus responded to Zach in a way that removed his shame, and Jesus believed in Zach's potential to do good. What if we were to do the same? What if we all were to make it personal? What if we were to know people by name, discover what matters to them, take the time to understand their story, respond in a way that replaces their shame with hope, and believes in their potential to live a remarkable story? Well, friends, enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time, and don't forget, make it personal.